Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to the talk. The European Studies Department and the History Department is so excited to welcome Dr. Sunnie Rucker-Chang to speak on her topic on marginalization and the limits of European belonging. This is part of our Imagine Europe series. And Dr. Rucker-Chang is an associate professor in Slavic, East European languages and cultures, and African American and African Studies departments at The Ohio State University. She's also the co-director of the Russian European. I don't know. Oh, please make sure that you mute yourself. Please mute yourself. Oh, well, we'll just do that. Okay, hold on, sorry. Okay, thank you for muting yourself. Okay, I think sorry about that. Okay, so Dr. Rucker-Chang, she's also the co-director of the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies undergraduate think tank at Howard University. She writes on culture, marginalization, and media in Southeast Europe. She's co-director and contributor to Cultures of Mobility and Alterity, Crossing the Balkans and Beyond by Liverpool University Press in 2022, co-author of Roma Rights and Civil Rights, a Transatlantic Comparison, Cambridge University Press 2020, and co-editor of and contributor to Chinese Migrants in Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe from Routledge Press in 2011. So again, welcome Dr. Sunnie Rucker-Chang on marginalization and the limits of European belonging. Thank you.
Okay, so just a second, I am going to share my screen here. And before I get started, however, I just want to say good morning to all of you here that are in this room, as well as everyone that is on Zoom, which there are people on Zoom, which is amazing. Thank you. It's really been a delight to be here in San Diego and meet the wonderful students and faculty who I've had a wonderful opportunity to interact with. And thank you sincerely to Drs. Emily Schuchman-Matthews and Annika Freiberg for their, or Freeberg, I've learned, for their invitation, and for Dr. Grace Chung for welcoming me into the class. The setup is a little odd, so I apologize for moving back and forth a little bit, but I'll get through it and we'll get through it together, right? So I would like to start by saying I'm not really sure when I came to realize that through my writings and teaching that an important goal for me was the pursuit of expanding knowledge production about minoritized peoples and marginalized peoples, other epistemologies and other theoretical frames beyond the canons, the accepted canons of Europe and Eastern European studies, because that's primarily what I do, and even geographies, but now it's clear to me. I also now recognize that it was indeed a biological impulse, to quote Cedric Robinson, that drove me to my pursuit of such knowledge. But it has become so much more than that. I could never find my place in anything that I was studying, and I longed to understand why. I eventually came to accept that the silences around marginalized and global majorities in my field and in the geographies that I work on were the area of my focus, were in part likely the byproduct of what we might call a lack of quote unquote diversity. A word that I really don't like, but we all understand it, and so I use it because we understand it collectively. There's a lack of diversity among scholarly ranks of faculty and students in my chosen field of Slavic and East European studies. So at some point, and again, I'm not exactly sure when, I began to wonder if I didn't depart from traditional studies of the region, who would? So here I am. I begin here with recognizing my positionality because I think it's infinitely important for all scholars to recognize their position to their work. It helps to explain in many instances how we choose the areas of study and scholarship, as much as why we do not choose certain areas. It can also help to quiet conversations about biases or silences in choice of scholarship or engagement with others, because articulating positionalities, it illustrates that we all have our biases and preferences and particular relationships with our subject areas, just sometimes we don't talk about it. So I am infinitely a scholar and a student, really, and a scholar of Southeast Europe, and particularly former Yugoslavia. I came to focus on the region by way of Russian and East European studies. The first place I landed in former Yugoslavia was in Serbia. It was 2003, and I went to study in Novi Sad, Serbia, a city that was truly in the process of renewal at that time. There were no tourists. More importantly, there were no bridges, and there was tape on windows because many of the windows had been blown out by a 78-day 1999 NATO bombing campaign. I landed in a place that was simultaneously in but not of Europe, to recall Stuart Hall. The lessons of the books, and here are some of the books. The lessons of the books that I had read and would later read in my coming years as a PhD student were coming to life before my eyes. I would have similar experiences in virtually empty Basčarši in Sarajevo, Bosnia, and it was the same in Dubrovnik, which is now in 2022 is unimaginable that Dubrovnik would be empty, but it was empty at the time. And when I landed in Tivat, Montenegro, I sat by myself, undisturbed, on a bench facing out to a beautiful landscape like nothing I had ever seen before. I could see signs recognizing the aid that the European Union had provided for post-war reconstruction of former Yugoslav countries, but nowhere that I traveled was really Europe proper. People that I talked to would say, maybe one day we'll be in Europe, but no, you've landed somewhere that isn't Europe, which was very puzzling to me, right? Because it is Europe, but it isn't Europe all at the same time. So I was in the other Europe, to, again, recall Stuart Hall, but also to recall Croatian author Dubravka Ugrešić when she says, I'm from the other Europe. The land was defined by communism, state socialism, and in the case of former Yugoslav countries, war and Islam. And I just want to take a minute here to look at some of these books. These are some of the Imagining the Balkans is necessary reading, really, for anyone who's interested in Balkan studies. And this is where we start. And we started there 20 years ago, and in Balkan studies, we continue. Balkan Ghost is another one that's regularly assigned. But these two books here, in many ways, help to define the way that we talk about the Balkans and former Yugoslavia specifically. But I wanted to sort of draw a line between the way that the Balkans was presented and the way that it is now. I have here a work by my colleague Teodor Dragostinova that looks at the Balkans and particularly Bulgaria and in the way that it contributed to the world, right? So taking these countries out of obscurity and putting them in dialogue with the world. And then also this book here by Slavic Drakulic, who herself is Croatian by birth, but really is more sort of a global citizen.
I had a problem with my connection.
I am going to.
Yeah. So one of the things, again, remember we started out with financial forces.
I can't figure out how.
Data was pushing it kind of in a different direction. So we wanted to make sure we were expanding our.
I can hear you speaking. If you all could mute yourselves, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Usually I can just mute them. Perfect. Thank you. Technology. All right. So this book by Slavic Drakulic, which I believe was just published last year or the year before, I can't remember, the last couple of years sort of blend into each other. This How to Survive Post-Communism. So she had a book that was How to Survive Communism and Even Laugh. Well, this new book on Cafe Europa Revisited talks about sort of the imbalances between East and West in the European Union, talking about how even though Croatia in particular is a member of the EU, the products are not the same. So the yogurt maybe isn't as sweet. There isn't as much chocolate in Kinder chocolate. So there's still a difference, right? So this difference persists. And I have this little image here, which I don't think you can even see because it's covered. But this sticker that was from the early 2000s that went on for a little while that says, I would like to be in Europe, right? And it's not even EU, it's Europe. And Bih, you can't see it in this room, but Bih is also Bosnia and Herzegovina, so it's a play on language. All right. So given the various forms of distance between Europe's halves, I believe it's useful to discuss what have been the defining frames of Europe and Europeanness, which I think is, thank you. And now you can see it. All right. So I think it's useful to think about Europe and Europeanness. And I know that some of you were given my article. So this is sort of a development on some of the themes that I've talked about in that article. But to think about how can it be that an entire region or countries in an entire region feels the need to work towards rejoining, or in some cases distancing itself as a mark of regional or cultural identity, rejoining Europe? And what does it mean to work towards Europeanness? Can it happen in a way similar to working towards whiteness in the United States, as David Roediger talks about, or Noel Ignatieff works about in the United States? And if these countries could be a beneficiary of Europeanness, what would that status bring? What kind of power might come from being European, right? Because they're in Europe, but not of it. So in reference to the Balkan or non-EU countries, at least being European would be an unmarked category. And these are terms that I regularly refer back to, this unmarked versus marked, whereby Europe is unmarked and Balkan or Southeast Europe is marked, right? This category would not always be elusive, as some countries have managed to change the way they are perceived and even affiliated. What I do in my classes, and I'm kind of having a mixed talk here because I see that there's undergraduates and also other people joining in, is I ask students where they would like to travel to in Europe, right? In an intro to European studies class. And what's been really interesting for me over the years is to see that line of where students want to go moving further and further east. But it usually stops with Dubrovnik, maybe Zagreb, and maybe Sarajevo if some of them are interested. But maybe this idea of Europe is expanding more than right before our very eyes. In our contemporary age, there are a number of significant events and periods that have helped to distance the Balkans and Eastern Europe from Europe, quote unquote. Europe has always been an idea, much like the West, quote unquote. And as Edouard Glissant, who is a Caribbean scholar, informs us, it always needed to be infused with meaning. And Gerard Delatny notes that Eurocentrism lay not in the idea of Europe itself as a cultural model, but in the structures of a discourse would serve to reinforce the power of the center. So how do we define Europe, or how Europe has been defined continually changes from period to period? So there's all of these different ways of thinking about Europe, the way that Europe changes from time to time. And I think it's also useful to think about some of the post-colonial scholars, right? In this regard, Aimé Césaire, who tells us, who warned people not to imitate Europe, right? For fear of what that would be if we had yet a third Europe. And he said specifically, let us not try to imitate Europe. Let us combine our muscles and our brains in a new direction. Let us try to create the whole man, whom Europe has been incapable of bringing to triumphant birth. And I add him here because frequently when we're thinking about Europe, we're thinking about ideas of Europe, those ideas are very Eurocentric, and we're not bringing in other ideas from the outside. So with that idea in mind, I think it's useful to think about the history of distancing from Eastern Europe and Europe. And I talked about this with students yesterday, but I always talk about it with my students, these years that continue to define Europe. So we have 1945, obviously, which in many ways is sort of the major cleaving between East and West. Post-World War II, 1989 regularly gets brought up. 1991 is another year that's really important, but we don't tend to talk about it too much. Why don't we talk about it? Is because there's this distance between East and West, but we're talking about the Yugoslav War, which had a sincere impact on differentiating between where Europe is not. Then, of course, we have 2001, which plenty of scholars argue still continues to contribute to the idea of what Europe is, and solidified the relationship between Europe, right? Europe really talking about Western Europe, and the United States, such that this idea of a Euro-America and a bigger, larger idea of the West comes to be, which again is still exclusive of the countries that are primarily EU, right? Then we have 2004, 2007, and 2013, which are the Eastern expansion of Europe, which really sort of causes a questioning of where Europe ends and begins, and how do you incorporate those countries that have always been seen as something other than? And Slavenko Drakulic has some answers to this in saying that they aren't really truly incorporated, right? They still very much are on the outside, right? They're not Schengen, they're not all Schengen countries. They don't all have the euro. They don't all have equal access. They can't all work. And when they go to work in Western Europe, they're still very much seen as outside of. All right. So I did want to show you this, thinking about the persistence of a cultural imaginary regarding Eastern Europe. And this made the rounds on social media earlier this year. The European Commission that was released this map for Youth Day this year. And you see we have all of these sites of culture, right? All of these wonderful sites of culture, and even Romania has a little vampire up here, right? But when we come down to the Balkans, we have a bear, right? And so this is a visual for any of my visual learners here, right? This tells you a lot about what the imaginary is. And some people said, well, it's just a map and it's fun for kids, but no, you have this blank space. There was a blank space there in the early 90s, a blank space there in the early 2000s. And here we are in 2022, and we have a bear. And most people that I know that live in the Balkans have never seen a bear just walking around. So something to think about there. All right. Oh, I forgot. The other year that's really important that I didn't talk so much about is 1961. And 1961 is another year that's frequently not necessarily included in the dialogue about European belonging, but it's a year that marks an important movement in decolonization. And frequently when we talk about decolonization, we place decolonization outside of Europe. We don't talk about post-colonial Europe, and we're starting to. We don't talk so much about post-colonial Europe, but post-colonialism and the movement toward decolonization affected Europe very much. 1961 is also an important year for anyone who is interested in non-aligned movement, because it marks the meeting of non-aligned movement, or the beginning of the non-aligned movement in the meeting that happened in Belgrade, where these countries said, we're not interested in blockism. We're not going to go with the capitalist West. We're not going to go with the communist East. We're going to do something else. So this year is also particularly defining for 1961. And sort of what I like to do with my work is reinfuse the spirit of that and thinking about Europe as it might exist elsewhere. Excuse me. So since the idea of West and Western cultures continue to be the key characteristics of what is not what is European, the people that are outside of that continue to be cast outside of so even in their typical absence of the post-colony, these spaces are tied to the definition of Europe, right? So when we talk about Europe, we have to think about all of these spaces that used to be colonized by Europe. And this is the map that I like to use in my Intro to European Studies classes and in my European Studies classes, because it really puts Europe into a broader dialogue with its overseas territories, its overseas possessions. And prior to Brexit, there were even more countries. So I want you to think about, this is typically the Europe that we see. And if I give my students a map quiz, this is the Europe that we get. But what happens to our understanding of where Europe resides or who is European when we start to look like this, when it starts to look like this? And I have a quote here, and I'm not going to read it, from a colleague, Manuel Boadka, who has a really brilliant article about thinking Europe otherwise and imagining other Europes, right? So what happens when we start to think about Europe as also being in the Caribbean? What happens when we start to think about aid that needs to happen after storms? We're in the midst of one right now, right? What happens when we think about these countries needing to have reconstruction? When we think about them having ties to European spaces, does that really change the imaginary that you have of Europe or aid? Or maybe not, but it's definitely something to think about, I believe. I also think it's really important to think about colonialism and post-colonialism in the context of Europe, because a number of European countries were themselves seat of empires, right? The metropoles defined and dictated the terms of power differentials, as well as perpetuated the practice of assigning worth to bodies based on their free or unpaid labor. And here I turn to Aníbal Quijano and his studies of coloniality, excuse me, to talk about this system that was set forth very early as the 15th century, and then normalized through the transatlantic slave trade. It continues to inform the way that their descendants experience the societies around them. And this is worldwide, right? So the system of assigning worth to bodies. So as Quijano notes, the idea of race and its modern meaning does not have a known history before the colonization of America. When we're talking about America, we're talking about America very broadly. So the Americas is really what we might think about. So furthermore, the system undergirds two very important twin ideas of race, as it can be broadly defined, namely that it is a product of capitalism, as many people assert, and that it is position imposed from the outside. We don't have race until it becomes something that is imposed from the outside, right? And if we can begin to think about that more broadly and not just as dwelling in the United States, we can start to have a much more informed dialogue and productive dialogue about what that means for belonging and difference. Finally, which I've already said this, it also helps, but it's worth saying again, to illustrate how race, while primarily associated with the United States, has deep European roots that must be considered when discussing the defining features of Europe. Not to say that race is always defined in terms of black and white, or sort of distance to and from those, because it's fluid, but the meanings of black and white are fundamental to understanding Europe as much as they are the United States, particularly as they relate to European colonial and post-colonial history, as well as the current engagement with diversity. And I say diversity here, I don't have it on a slide, but you know, the saying, the phrase or the slogan for Europe is united in diversity. Well, what does diversity mean if we can't even talk about race, right? We can talk about culture, absolutely, but it's very difficult to capture that culture or that diversity without having people that look different, right? So the racial hierarchies that the transatlantic slave trade created and maintained continue to influence the experience of negatively racialized peoples. And I say here negatively racialized because we're all racialized. It's just a matter if it's positively racialized or negatively racialized, particularly for those who are viewed through the lens of Blackness, be it by the way of global framing of Blackness, the African diaspora, localized racialized structures that reproduce racial logics of Black and white, but on local character. Their distance from the unmarked category of whiteness or European in some cases renders them external to the body of the nation and its imaginary. But because they are frequently framed as different or something other than the national norm, they continue to be externalized. And in the European case, this is incredibly important because as scholar Fatima El-Tayyib notes, within the case, and I believe she's specifically referencing Germany, but you have people who are considered to be third generation migrants. What does that mean? And I always ask, most of my work these days is really about Romani communities. And I ask, how long does a person have to live in a country to be considered part of that country, to be considered a part of the nation? But this third generation migrants gives us a sense that these people will probably regularly be externalized, even though they've been there for generations. All right, so the racial logics that dislodge populations from European belonging do not simply affect those negatively racialized as Black or migrant, or Roma, as the case may be, when I'll get to that in a minute. It also has an impact on those who are white, but not quite. Now try to follow this here if you do not know this concept. So this is people who are racialized as peripherally white or adjacent to European whiteness because of their distance from Europe proper. And this is essentially getting back to the discussion of Eastern Europe or Southeast Europe. This position of distinction becomes important as it solidifies that a primary characteristic of European belonging is not simply Christian, because when we get to Eastern Europe and we get to Southeast Europe, the majority in most countries, with a few exceptions, you're talking about Christian nations, but it's not enough to just be Christian. You have to be Christian and white, whereby white is this category that's defined by Western Europe. So, and returning again to El-Tayyib, who notes that this function, so whiteness and Christianity function as central, but largely invisible factors in European concepts of identity. And I believe that when she wrote this was absolutely the case, but I think as time goes on, it's becoming much clearer that these are not as invisible as we once thought. All right. So this is where the post-colonial and the post-socialist in many ways start to converge. At least the way that I see it. So because you can see a connection between whiteness in Europe and the ramification that it has for belonging, and it has implications in Eastern Europe. To the outside, these spaces may present racially as white, and I have this conversation with my colleagues all the time and talking about peripheral whiteness. It's a very niche concept, and who knows exactly what's going on when we're talking about peripheral whiteness, but the whiteness that exists in Southeast Europe and Eastern Europe is very much a mediated whiteness, limited by the possibility to adapt and conform to the norms of a majority that will usually be out of reach for a generation or two. That is to say that if people go east and then travel to west, that first generation will have what's called an accented identity. That means that when they speak, it'll be very clear that they came from somewhere else, but in a generation or two, that goes away, right? But as peripherally European and therefore owning peripheral whiteness, they are also in possession This peripheral whiteness, as Anna Safuta notes, is a concept introduced to account for the simultaneous privilege and subordination experienced by white migrants from non-Western countries. It is still a privileged position, yes, when compared to those racialized as non-white, but, quote, peripheral whiteness does not only mark its bearers as different, but often as backward, simple-minded, and unworthy of respect. So such a post-colonial hierarchy distinguishes rich and modern Western European countries from Eastern European ones perceived as poor and backward. So what I'm trying to show here is that this idea of European affects negatively racialized people, but it also affects sort of this negatively racialized, but not completely negatively racialized people as well. So those who are defined as peripherally European and peripherally white lack the power to control how they belong to their whiteness, at least for a generation or two. As a result, these spaces must work to further entrench themselves to a whiteness that is not guaranteed, a whiteness which the unmarked and defining category of Europe. So it relates to the Balkans, as it relates to the Balkans in particular, is further complicated by the relatively recent history of the region, or not relatively recent, depending on how far back you want to go into history, that is defined by war and populations that are majority Muslim. The connection of Islam in Europe is not a logical one to make, particularly as various spaces in Europe have worked to create a great distance between their populations and citizens from Muslim citizens and Islam as a religion. And this goes back to my earlier conversation about this post-2001 idea of Europe, which many would say is just a renewal of something that existed before. But it's an interesting thing to think about this in regard to the Balkans, because since 2015, the Balkans has now become kind of a buffer zone, right? That is really in the service of blocking migrations from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And while migrants from former Eastern European countries are at the same time subjected to control, discrimination, and the process of deportation from the former. And this is coming from my colleague, Peripheral Whiteness, right? So there is both a distance and a connection for Europe. This is part of this peripheral whiteness, right? So to belong for countries in Central and Southeast Europe requires taking into account the imitation of Western modernity by Eastern Europe with racism at its core. And this takes on numerous pernicious forms and mimics and reproduce racisms that mirror the racist practice and enforced racial hierarchies of Western Europe by way of focal constructs and populations. That is not to say that racial hierarchies did not exist with impactful effects on marginalized populations prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it's really important to understand that prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was so much that was unsaid, and there was so much that was unable to be unsaid, that a lot of these racial hierarchies and differences that existed in these societies were silenced and did not have a place to come to light. So when considering race and racialization in the context of the Balkans, it is initially challenging to see how a space that is negatively racialized in its own right and burdened by the racial capitalism of Europe as a class of workers is mirroring the production of race and racialized structures of the West. So frequently these conversations are that we ourselves are racialized within Europe, negatively racialized. We ourselves are negatively affected by Europe and this idea of Europe. So how could we ourselves be producing the same structures? Well, it's important to think through how that mirroring is happening. So in an attempt to become European in part, they are not a part of what is referenced by what is Europe, but now the Balkans have become the barrier and the guardians of the border of Europe. It is also a case that their deeply racialized Romani populations, as well as religious minorities, are frequently cast outside of the nation in a push for homogeneity and convergence of people, place, and nation. So that is to say that you have kind of micro, not even micro, but you really have our localized racialized hierarchies in these spaces. So this need to constantly define and redefine the nation by ever more narrow contours pushes members of marginalized populations even further to the outside of not just the cultural imaginary, but ever closer to the margins of safety, precarity, and even surveillance, poor health outcomes, and poor access to life and death. In this way, the differences and access to Europeanness in both East and West converge. right? And we saw this a lot during COVID-19, which is the height of COVID, when we're not out of COVID-19, obviously, but we saw this in 2020 and 2021, where these marginalized populations were dying and falling ill at larger proportions, but numbers disproportionate to their populations, but because of a lack of engagement and lack of willingness to acknowledge the differences that are there, it was very difficult to really document who was dying and in what numbers. So a lot of this wound up being anecdotal, but it was very clear that certain populations were affected more. So thinking about neo-racism, surveillance, violence, and talking back, I just want to sort of stop for a minute, sort of slow down. I think I'm okay, to look at some of these images. And what I've tried to do here is have sort of a conversation with the images that I've chosen here. This here, I don't need you to be that smart presentation. Okay, so the image at the bottom comes from Stuart Hall. And it is talking about representation, and it's talking about how certain images start to be understood in particular ways because we become conditioned to think about them. And so what he's talking about here is how particularly racialized people, in this case, Black men, in the context of the UK, begin to be seen in a particular way. And when we start to see people in a particular way, it's very easy to push them away and to have them have like negative effects, like what I just talked about with health and life and access to death, something that we frequently call necropolitics or the necropolitical state. And then over on the far left, I have an image, one of the campaigns from UKIP, from the Brexit campaign, which is helping to illustrate just how much the image of the migrant has been used to cast distance or to distance the idea of Europe from people, and how in this case with the Brexit campaign, this massive other that was going to come in if they did not distance themselves. Now, the UK is an interesting case, and that's not my area, right? Because it's no longer Europe. And this is one of these countries that felt the need, and I referenced it, to distance themselves so strongly as a mark of their belonging or distance from it. So that's that. Over on the right-hand side, this, I believe, is from, I can't remember. Oh, this is in Paris, not Berlin. So this is a BLM march, Black Lives Matter march, that happened in Paris in 2020. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter and the role that it's continuing to play in Europe. And then up at the top, this is just from this summer, from a Roma man whose name was Stanislav Tomasz, who died after an interaction with the police. This man, Mr. Tomasz, was actually being called the Czech George Floyd because he died after a policeman had his knee on his neck, right? Which raised all kinds of conversations about why was this man being called the Czech George Floyd, why didn't he exist in his own right? But then also it raises really important conversations about policing, surveillance, and also just the value of those individuals who are not considered European in the most traditional sense. So I'm getting back to the talk. And I wrote some about the Black Lives Matter marches and the intersection between Black Lives Matter and Romani communities in Europe, if any of you are interested. So in the summer of 2020, Black Lives Matter protests swept through the Western world. And as I wrote in the spring of 2021, Black Lives Matter solidarity marches sprang up in Canada and throughout Europe, particularly in West European states where Black people constitute a measurable percent of the population. In these seats of former empires, there were thousands, and in some cases, tens of thousands, as we can see here in Paris, of people who participated in these marches. And like those in the marches and protests in the US and Canada, participants in European spaces demanded equality for Black lives, whereby the idea of Black lives was sort of much larger than just, being part of an African diaspora. Increased awareness of their systemic marginalization, also called neo-racism in other places, and just basic everyday racism and recognition of the generational impact of colonialism on the perpetuation of racial hierarchies there. BLM solidarity marches took place in Central and Southeast Europe countries as well. In Budapest, Podgorica, Belgrade, Pristina, Sofia, and Zagreb, people belonging to diasporic African communities marched with majorities to assert that Black Lives Matter. A number of local media outlets covered the marches, one of which featured a woman at the Podgorica protest who stood with a sign in English that read, "Prejudice against Roma people is also racism." With this one sign, the contradictory nature of the marches was apparent. Many people in capital cities in Eastern Europe stood in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, but not the Roma members of their local populations who have likewise suffered generationally from systemic racism. The protesters failed to acknowledge that all Black Lives Matter, and I quoted there from an article from R.E.E.S in Kosovo 2.0. These protests illustrated why a constant denial of the existence of race in Europe leaves blind spots and how we can understand Europe and Europeanness as limited, exclusive, and lacking in diversity. Again, diversity. They highlight how constant othering and externalizing of populations that are significant to Europe renders it easy to discount challenges when they come from those that are externalized. In Western Europe, this comes in the constant denial of the post-colonial condition, having an impact on Europe as much as any of the former colonies in other ways, but this is just one example. It also comes in the form of Romani surveillance, excessive policing, and the racialization of Romani labor, which also happens in Western European capitals. It is a problem manifest from the reality of never being seen as part of the society in which you live or belong or being able to fully participate. It has dire consequences, as we witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic, and as we continue to see reflected in police brutality and other forms of systemic racism that affect the access to life for members of these communities. I mention this here because I believe it's important to highlight how theoretical positions on belonging and difference, which I started the talk with, have real effects on the daily lives of citizens. For those who have been excluded from the nation, it's been easy to ignore and dismiss their challenges within their societies, as well as their challenges to power structures because they are simultaneously visible, but also invisible to the people who ignore and distance them for generations. This is the case for Europeans of color who are strangers or migrants in their own societies, but also the case for those who are attempting to achieve asylum, safe shelter, or even a livable wage for them and their families in another country, which in many cases is their right by EU citizenship. Related is also the position of these considered peripherally white who are from Eastern Europe or the Balkans, whose labor is undervalued and underappreciated, but desperately needed for the functioning of society, as well as for the benefit of the families. As I start to wrap up here, I want to share a story with you. I was trying to figure out how to work this in. So here it goes. Flying from Belgrade in December last year on a horribly delayed flight. It was just tons of snow outside. And so we were delayed by about 4 hours. And we finally get on the plane and we're all exhausted and nobody wants to talk to anyone. But this man sits next to this woman and says, "Are you Dutch? You really look Dutch." And she goes, "I'm not Dutch. Why do you say that?" He's like, "Well, you're really tall and you have blonde hair. So are you sure, like, no one in your family is Dutch?" And she's like, "No, I'm not Dutch. Why do you say that?" Right? And I think, please just leave this poor woman alone. We're all really tired, but it says something about who gets to belong, right? And you contrast that to when we land in Amsterdam and I get out, and I should say that this is always a test. When I get out to in a particular European country, I go, is someone going to talk to me in the language? Do they think that I'm theirs, right? So I get out and I'm trying to wait and see. And as soon as I land, everyone is speaking to me in Dutch as well, because people think everywhere I go in Western Europe, not in Eastern Europe, that I could be theirs, right? And we can talk about what that means or not. But these twin occurrences that happen within hours of each other that say that maybe I could be Dutch, but this other woman who stereotypically looks Dutch, made me question and continues to make me question what assigns countries and their citizens a place on the hierarchy of whiteness, and therefore their ranking of European, and how it's projected upon those who are defined in such a way. So how do I get to be Dutch for some people, but not for others? But then this woman is probably universally understood to be Dutch, perhaps, right? And that is to say that those who do not look a particular way will have a difficult time being imagined as belonging to a particular European group, or their existence will be mediated or limited in no small way, where their bodies and life experiences are affected by a biopolitical state that continually tells them that they do not belong and does little to protect their health, well-being, and safety. In fact, in some cases, it may actively work against it because they're not seen as being a part of it. So, sort of in conclusion, I believe it's necessary, which I think this is really clear, but we all have to have conclusions, right? I believe it's necessary to look critically at our terms, how we use them, and continue to institutionalize them frequently without merit into the erasure of others. In rendering Europe one thing and reducing it to the western half of the continent, we create the transatlantic Euro-America connection, which is defined really by an ugly history of exclusion and historical erasures that are excised from a broader historical narrative. If we are to engage with Europe, take apart its parts, and become more inclusive, we can expand the frames of what we do, and it will also likely be much easier to expand the frame of who does the work. I won't be standing here as one of a handful that are engaging in this work, and hopefully it will be more commonplace to have these types of conversations. And with that, I thank you for your time. If anyone is interested or wants to get in touch, there's my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have time for some questions. If you're joining us on Zoom, why don't you go ahead and put your questions in a chat, and we'll start with anybody that's here who wants to ask a question in person. Anybody like to start? Do we have any in the chat yet? Any questions? Well, I have one. Sure. You talked about how people who are positioned outside of Europe are sort of aspiring to be European. How is that kind of performed or, you know, verbalized? Like, what does that look like in terms of them wanting to whatever that means to become European?
So,
Oh, yeah. Question.
so I think that there's a couple of ways. So like there's this idea that there's a political piece of it. So there's certain segments in, most of the time that I go, I'm in Serbia. And so there's this idea that we have to have a particular government that is pushing us in a particular way in order for us to join Europe. And as long as we are doing this, then we will never be able to get to another place. But a sort of a more negative way of thinking about it is exactly the way that I talked about it, by seeing these structures of sort of the performance of whiteness and the performance of the nation as being one thing, and therefore working actively to exclude those that are outside of it. Now, I don't know that there's necessarily, I'm not sure that anybody would necessarily say, yes, this is exactly what I'm doing. But when you see that mirroring going on, I think it's very difficult to deny that that's the case. And honestly, most of the times that I'm talking to people, depending on who you're talking to, they will say that we're racialized ourselves. So how can we do this? But there's a lack of recognition that that is happening.
You have two questions.
Yeah. Sure. How does this relate to human rights? Well, it relates to human rights because the people who are constantly denied their status or denied their humanhood or their personhood are frequently excluded and therefore denied very basic human rights. And one of the big things is, for example, is education. I didn't talk about this in my talk, but having a lack of access to fair education, equal opportunities in education is a violation of human rights. And part of that is the stereotypes and the ideas about certain groups, maybe the fact that they're not educable, the fact that they are not going to be able to perform in a typical classroom pushes them outside. And this is one of the aspects of human rights. It's also free movement, right? Because people are denied their access to free movement. So these are just some of the ways that there's an access to human rights, but just their general existence in many ways becomes a struggle because they're not protected. And how has racial outcasting and externalization in Europe changed throughout history? It's a really big question. Do you have a particular period? So I tell you what, it's open, so I'll just answer it. I would say within Eastern Europe, which is my area, following the fall of the Berlin Wall in the early 1990s is where you really start to see the effects of the externalization. Not to say that it wasn't there before, because it definitely was there before. It was just a lot more hidden and a lot more covered because of censorship. But you start to see in Romania, Hungary, and this is even not so long ago, where Roma settlements are set on fire, people are beaten, And these are some of the examples, but this is all very much post 89, post in the early 90s. And so you see lots of movement out of these countries as a result of their consistent negative treatment.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. I'm a China scholar, and I just had a little story and then a question because I kept thinking about this throughout your talk. Back in 1999, I was a graduate student in a Chinese university, living in a Chinese foreign student dorm with people from Russia and Eastern Europe and Iran and Japan and Korea, very international. And then America bombed the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, and Chinese population was really angry. Nobody believed the old map story. So the foreign student people told everybody who was white and American and European to stay inside for 24 hours. And it was very bizarre because you had people on all different political spectrums, Russians and Eastern Europeans and Americans and everybody white, right?
Yeah,
Basically,
yeah.
They didn't say that, but
Right.
America, European staying inside, and then Japanese and Korean and Vietnamese students going out and bringing food, cutting across all politics.
Yeah.
And so what it made me think about with your talk was the Eastern European, the people you're saying don't feel white, yet if they're in Africa or Asia, regardless of whether they were part of a colonizer, they are white to the extent that overrides anything else. And I guess how would they deal with that vis-a-vis Africa or Asia if you've had any experience? It sounded like you've written about Chinese.
I've written about the Chinese,
I was
yeah.
Curious.
So I've written about Chinese and Eastern Europe, right? And it's really interesting because now I'm looking at it in terms of a perpetual foreigner type situation, because we're going on third generation now of Chinese people. All right, so we're going on third generation, right? So what does it always mean to be a foreigner, even in your own country, which you're familiar with this? I wanted to clarify a point in your question. You said they were Lao Mei. What did you say?
I just European and American.
Oh, okay. I thought you said something Mandarin. Anyway,
European and American.
got it.
Use the word white.
Yes. Okay. So, Ojo made Megwa. Okay. So I was trying to figure out what that meant. So at any rate, so this is the problem with this framework, right? So it has to be recognized that this peripheral whiteness doesn't travel the same everywhere, right? So when I'm having this conversation with people, I say, but this is like this nuanced argument that means nothing to anybody else. Like, because when you travel, you're still seen as being European, right? But then there's been work that's been done that says, there's the accented English problem, right? But you have to open your mouth, you have to talk in order to be seen that way. So I think that there are now some Serbs anyway that are starting to go to China. Confucius Institute is funding studies for them to go. And so their experience then becomes one of a European, right? So the next sort of level to work on this is this sort of mobile Europeanness, right? Or sort of transitionally, I don't know exactly where that's where you are something else on the continent, but as soon as you leave, you become something else. So the book that we have coming out that is on migration, I talk exactly about this, where I say that race is this unstable category where it means one thing one place and one thing something else, right? So in a European context, these Eastern Europeans are not quite white enough, but in the United States, they're going to be something else. And then in Asia and African countries, inevitably. Like I haven't seen the work done on that, but inevitably, yes, they are going to be this like type situation where they're just white populations. Yeah, but it's fascinating, right? Because this is the work of race studies where it just becomes, it's an unstable category completely, independent on context. Thank you. Yeah.
Is there any other place than in Eastern Europe that this peripheral whiteness functions? What are they? What are those places?
And other than Eastern Europe?
Yeah.
So
is the concept used anywhere else? Is it like something that
Not that I know of. However, I think the next sort of thing about this would be to think about whiteness as not necessarily a marker of skin only, but having power and having access, right? So if we think about the concept, and this is sort of somewhat far afield, we think about whiteness as being unmarked and whiteness as being power, as having power, then within different contexts, what whiteness means is going to have to be something else. In the Chinese context, for example, I've done presentations on Chinese in Eastern Europe, then how do you make this term move to other locales, right? Can we talk about whiteness in China? Probably, if we sort of divorce it from its sort of physical features, right? It's about power, it's about who has that. So then it means that then moving into other contexts, it is about having not full power, but appearing a particular way, but not having full power. In the context of Europe, I'm not sure that I've ever heard it outside of East European studies, right? Because it's always this East-West divide, which maybe opens up some other questions about what we're doing in our field and how niche it is and how sort of self-reflective, maybe to a point of extreme, like to an extreme point that maybe we don't need to even think that way, because in another context, it's just, these are the people that present in a particular way. Yeah, but I'm curious to know if anyone knows that peripheral whiteness, I'm going to call in just a second. If anyone knows of peripheral whiteness working in a different context, I'd be really interested to know, even if somebody here on the chat or on Zoom. Yeah.
Excuse me, the term peripheral whiteness, I wasn't familiar with before, but there is a literature on the Irish in England in the 19th century, in the United States in the 19th century, and of course on Southern and Eastern European immigrants to the United States.
Yes.
In the early 20th century.
Yes.
It's the story of prohibition.
Yeah, yeah. And then thank you for bringing that up, because then it is this idea that I talked about at the beginning of working toward whiteness, right? So then maybe this peripheral whiteness, I'm not sure that it's been used in that context, but maybe that intermediary period where they were not quite there yet, they hadn't been fully assimilated or thought of as being white, would be that state of being peripherally white until it was they could be more included into those structures of whiteness in the United States. Yeah, thank you for that.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. I really appreciated all of the scholars you were citing, and a lot of them are coming from the Balkans. They're coming from these externalized areas. Like, what is the kind of receptiveness or the research being done from the other side to these critiques?
So to the critique,
to the ideas of the exclusivity of Western Europe.
Yeah, there's some really exciting work being done. And so I talked about Manuela Boatka, and the work that she said. She just had a book come out, I think earlier this week, actually, where she is talking about creolization and thinking about creolization in Romania. Really just fascinating stuff, because I think one of the things that we could do, and it's not just European studies broadly, but also Eastern European studies specifically, looking to other frames, looking to other places. So Manuela Boatka, Piero Reggepi has a book coming out on whiteness. I could give you a whole entire list of names, but there is this conversation of talking back, right? And this tradition of talking back, and honestly, the entire field of critical Romani studies that has emerged has become a powerhouse in sort of pushing back and saying, we need to have a place too, and we are not included in these spaces when we talk about Europe, and how might we counteract the conversation. So happy to send that bibliographical information along, because this goes to all of you, like the work that we do. If we can include local scholars, it's absolutely necessary, particularly as someone who is very much not connected to this region at all. I can say what I want to say as a Western scholar, and I have this platform and I've been invited here, but a lot of times those voices don't make it. And so, showcasing and highlighting the work that they're doing is incredibly important. So thank you so much for asking, but, making those connections, seeing the Balkans is not just tiny countries in Eastern Europe, but that have histories and cultural settings and cultural realities that look a lot like other places. Yeah.
I'm noticing one more question there from our department chair, Claire Sickle.
So Southern Europeans and especially Southern Italians can be considered peripherally white. Okay, this is not my area, but thank you for raising that point. I think it's about hierarchies. Are there any human rights organizations in Eastern? There are plenty of human rights organizations in Eastern Europe. If you are interested, please send me an email and I'll be happy to send them to you. The book that I co-authored on Roma rights and civil rights, we worked and talked to a number of human rights organizations in Eastern Europe, and I'd be happy to send that information to you. You know, I'm not sure who termed who coined the term peripheral whiteness. I've just seen it popping up in a lot of places, but I think it's a really, I completely agree with you that it is a productive concept, because I've given presentations in Belgrade specifically, and people say, well, no, you know, what about Todorov, what about Balkanism? We ourselves are racialized, so how could we be racialized? But the idea of peripheral whiteness gives us sort of a door, an opening into discussing the various hierarchies that exist even within these spaces that are racialized themselves. But it's a good question, and I looked and I looked and I wasn't able to find the origin of the term. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the Black Lives Matter protests in Eastern Europe and Europe more broadly. What effect did they have on those places? Were there backlashes? Were there productive conversations starting? Did it go away and we pretended it never happened? What happened after?
So
I mean, it's a very recent question, obviously. So
it is a recent question.
You were there and like.
So I find the Black Lives Matter marches that happened in Eastern Europe, what's the best, it's an interesting thing that they happened, but I think that without sort of some self-reflection and saying, what about our own marginalized populations and how are we going to make their lives a little bit better, they sort of ring hollow and they almost feel performative.
They perform for was it a protest of America or?
So it wasn't, no, I don't know that it was necessarily a protest of America so much as it was. I mean, for some people, of course, it was going to be a protest of America. Like we told you that they're really racist and really look what they're doing. But I think there was a Montenegrin singer who said, you know, we can have Black Lives Matter marches and that's great, but we don't really have enough Black people here for it to really mean anything, right? So what we really need to do is think about our Romani populations. How many Romani friends do you have? How many Romani people do you interact with? And so what happened for a minute anyway, as a result of these the BLM marches, was there was this dialogue about, what about our own marginalized populations? What about our own Black populations? Because in some context, Roma are called Black within them. So like, and that's, I think I had a quote about this is, you know, Roma are a part of Black Lives Matter, right? So then there was this intellectual debate, right, which who knows how far those ever go, about Black Lives Matter and what does it mean within the context of Eastern Europe. And there were, but the actual Black Lives Matter marches that happened that were also Roma Lives Matter, which some people took issue with the use of that. No one really showed up for those protests. So it was like, you're standing up for these hypothetical Black populations that don't really exist in large numbers without really recognizing the issues that exist at home that really mirror or look a lot like what you're protesting against. So it's the contradiction, at least, really came to be a conversation. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you all.
Dr. Chang.
Thank you.